Dear students, welcome you all to the lecture on J.S. Mill. This lecture will make you to understand his refining of utilitarianism, to know Mill's utilitarian defense of liberty, to understand his thought on freedom of action and Mill's views on women. To start with, John Stuart Mill is one among the greatest theorists of the Western philosophical tradition. He is regarded by many as among the most impactful 19th century British philosophers. He was an empiricist who believed that human beings could keep on improving their society with continual pursuit of knowledge. Mill saw himself as a utilitarian philosopher, but he diverged significantly from Bentham's utilitarianism as he wanted to temper it with a more ethical framework. Hence, he offered a pointed critique of Bentham's utilitarian framework, and Mill's utilitarianism came to be known as the real utilitarianism, as opposed to Bentham's act utilitarianism. Mill's rule utilitarianism is often credited for having attempted an ambitious rights utility synthesis and therefore marked a key development in our understanding of both rights and utility. It addressed some of the limitations of Bentham's framework by offering better protection of minority rights and individual rights. Some have argued that Mill was able to find an intellectual middle ground between inflexibility of Kant's ethical deontology and the hedonistic Benthamite utilitarianism. Such a contribution in itself has endured that J.S. Mill will have an exalted place in the history of Western political philosophy, as it is no small feat. Yet, it is a testimony to the greatness of J.S. Mill that he offered many more deep insights. In fact, arguably his greatest contribution to political philosophy was his staunch defense of liberty. His utilitarian defense of liberty has inspired constitutions across the world and is an inevitable part of the continuing modern discourse on liberty. His views on women were also far ahead of his times. In this lecture, we will examine the life and ideas of J.S. Mill in detail. Let us begin by discussing the personal and historical context of J.S. Mill, which had a great influence on his political philosophy. John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 in London to James Mill, a utilitarian philosopher and a disciplinarian father. James Mill wanted his son to excel in academic knowledge and therefore maintained a strict regiment for J.S. Mill. Thus, J.S. Mill became introduced to classics, arithmetic and languages at an early stage, and he excelled in all of them. However, his regimented upbringing contributed to him having a mental crisis in 1826. Likely because of his experience, Mill, while valued the importance of education, at the same time became a staunch advocate of personal liberty. Like his father, Mill subscribed to a utilitarian philosophy inspired by Bentham. However, Mill would go on to refine it and make it more morally palatable. J.S. Mill met the love of his life, Harriet Taylor, in 1830, who was married at that time. She was his intellectual and personal soulmate, and he maintained a friendship with her till her husband died eventually marrying her in 1851. Harriet Taylor was a philosopher in her own right, and Mill acknowledged her as an intellectual influence on his works and noted her as the co-author of his works on liberty and subjection of women. Certainly, she was an inspiration for his progressive views on women. J.S. Mill died in 1873 after writing many key works of philosophy, which includes On Liberty, Utilitarianism and the Subjection of Women. He had lived during a period of rapid social and economic transformation in Europe, especially in England, which was where the Industrial Revolution had started. Feudal structures were giving way to modern elements, driven by the emergence of new classes in society, thanks to urbanization and industrialization. People also sought to organize society in a more scientific manner and started to question the legitimacy of the ancient structures like monarchy and patriarchy. It is in such a context one has to locate Mill's utilitarianism and his other ideas. Let us begin with Mill's refining of utilitarianism. Bentham's utilitarianism was based on the principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number. While Mill largely agreed with this principle, he was concerned about two aspects. Firstly, in his view, Bentham had not differentiated between higher order pleasures and lower order pleasures. Mill felt that not all pleasures are equal, unlike Bentham, who was more hedonistic. Thus, Mill wrote, and I quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is only because they only know their own side of the question." Unquote. Hence, Mill argued that one can differentiate and hierarchize pleasures, and the society should incentivize higher order pleasures like education, art, music, etc., as opposed to lower order pleasures like alcohol, entertainment, etc. The learned elite of a society can, through their experience, determine which are the higher order pleasures and which are the lower order pleasures. Maximizing pleasures should be therefore done in a thoughtful manner, focusing on qualitatively better pleasures. Secondly, Mill wanted to offer better protection of minority rights in comparison to Bentham's framework, which can be used for crude majoritarian impulses. So, he argued that the maxim of the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be applied to the rule or principle behind actions rather than actions themselves directly. And if the rule or principle provides greatest happiness of the greatest number for the greatest number of times, then it should be adopted even if on individual occasions the majority did not see greatest happiness. Thus, utility calculation should be made not on individual acts, but rather on rules behind those acts. This is why his utilitarianism came to be known as rule utilitarianism, as opposed to Bentham's traditional act of utilitarianism. Mill felt that such a system would better protect individual and minority rights. For example, randomly killing a person without due process as an act might on an individual occasion bring greatest happiness to the greatest number in a society, thereby satisfying Bentham's utility calculus. However, if rule utilitarianism is applied, then the rule behind it that is right to due process, has to be evaluated in terms of whether it provided greatest happiness for the greatest number for the greatest number of times rather than that particular act. Such an analysis might lead to a different conclusion and thereby protecting individual rights. Mill's utilitarianism therefore offers better protection for individual rights than Bentham, while retaining the core tenets of utilitarianism. During his time, Kant's deontology was seen as providing an ethical framework which was inflexible, focusing only on rights, whereas Bentham's framework was accused of providing a too flexible framework which sacrificed rights on the altar of utility. It was in such a scenario Mill was writing, and his framework strikes a balance between protection of rights and promotion of utility, thereby offering a rights utility synthesis. Thus, his approach enabled societies to have a stability of having a settled system of rights, which were also not rigid as they were ultimately based on utility calculations. J.S. Mill's greatest contribution to the philosophy is likely to be his utilitarian defense of liberty. Mill was a great advocate of liberties of thought, expression, actions and associations. He based his advocacy not on speculative notions like natural rights, but sought to ground it on utility. He wanted to show the utility of individual liberty to society. He argued that while individual liberties might not on every occasion be beneficial to society, on the whole, as a principle or a rule, they result in greatest happiness of the greatest number for the greatest number of times. Let us have more detailed look at his famous defense of liberty. With respect to freedom of thought and expression, Mill was an absolutist who believed there should be no constraints at all on individual. So he wrote, and I am quoting, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." Unquote. Mill would give 4 reasons of utility for his free speech absolutism. Firstly, he argued that majority need not always be right, and therefore their opinion, even if deeply held to be true, need not be true. Hence, suppression of minority opinions can lead to society being denied access to true opinions and benefit from it. Certainly, history is littered with examples of majority opinions being wrong, and Mill's argument of majority belief, not a guaranteed authenticator of truths, is valid. Therefore, allowing of minority opinions to be expressed can actually have social utility because they can turn out to be true. And since we cannot know which minority opinions will turn out to be true eventually, it is better to allow all opinions. This is the first argument he makes. He anticipated criticisms that will wonder about the damage caused by minority opinions which turn out to be wrong. Mill therefore goes on to give 3 reasons why allowing even wrong opinions has social utility. Firstly, he argues that suppressed opinions might have half-truths, and the actual truth might emerge out of a dialogue between a variety of opinions. suppression of free speech will prevent such a dialogue from happening and thereby preventing the emergence of truth, harming the social utility. Secondly, he argues that if an opinion is false, it is such false opinions that keep the truths living as through constant engagement with false opinions. Truths shine out better and do not become dead dogmas. This can also lead to greater refinement of truths and better clarity, thereby providing social utility. Lastly, Mill argues that if truth becomes dead dogma due to suppression of all opposing opinions, we lose the meaning of truth as people might not know when they believe what they believe. Thus, for Mill, freedom of expression needs to be absolute and no restrictions in this respect are justified from the angle of social utility. Freedom of action. With regard to freedom of action, Mill distinguishes between self and other regarding actions. Mill argued that with respect to actions that have effect only on the self, a person needs to be given absolute freedom. Society should not seek to control or regulate such self-regarding actions. The only actions which can be regulated are those which affect others. Here, Mill advocated the harm principle. So, he wrote, and I am quoting, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant." Unquote. Thus, only those actions which harm others can be regulated by society. Mill was against regulating actions which cause offence, as the harm has to be tangible and physical rather than a mere offence of sentiment or feeling. Mill felt that if offence became the principle of regulation, then anyone can feel offended by anything, even by self-regarding actions of others with respect to how they dress or live, which will be an infringement of individual freedom. Therefore, he felt that only harm-inducing actions need to be regulated. How does such freedom contribute to social utility? Mill's answer was that existence of such freedom would promote diverse experiments of living through some of them great ideas, perspectives or inventions can emerge, benefiting the entire society. Suppression of such freedom would lead to conformity and promotion of standardized mediocrity, and the society would miss out on new ideas and perspectives, harming the social utility. It is not that Mill is arguing that every experiment of living will lead to new ideas, but since we don't know which ones will, society needs to permit all of them as long as others are not being harmed. Hence, here too, Mill is a great advocate of individual freedom and he manages to link it with social utility. Mill also defends freedom of association on similar grounds. Freedom of association leads to different experiments of collaboration, some of which might outshine governmental actions. It also contributes to the individual's developing mentally and intellectually, thereby benefiting social utility. Ultimately, one can argue that Mill's defense of utility assumes that freedom is important for individual development mentally and socially. And as a principle or rule, individual development will lead to net social development, thereby contributing to greatest happiness of the greatest number. In this manner, Mill is able to link individual freedom with social utility. It is interesting to note that even today, countries with more liberties tend to do better in innovations and fostering new knowledge, thereby giving credence to Mill's ideas. Mill's another key contribution were his progressive views on women. Mill was true to his utilitarian self here, as well as he thought women's subordination was harming social utility. So he wrote, and I quote, that the principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong in itself. And now, one of the chief hindrances to human improvement, and that it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality, admitting no power or privilege on the one side nor disability on the other, unquote. Mill was frustrated that while progress towards equality was being made in several other spheres of society, the subjection of women was not being sufficiently challenged. Mill first of all rejected the primary arguments being circulated in favor of women's subjugation during his time. Some were arguing that this was a historical practice, therefore must have some logic. Mill rejected this by pointing to other historical practices like slavery, which clearly turned out to be ethically and socially wrong. Some others were arguing that women's nature was different. Mill countered them by arguing that women's so-called nature was a result of socialization, and only when women are given freedoms can they freely exercise their nature. Having rejected such arguments from the defenders of women's subjugation, Mill went on to make the case for the advantages of treating women equally to society. Firstly, Mill argued that women's equality will ensure that families were not spaces of despotism, and practicing of equality within family would enable citizens to be better subjects of democratic regimes as they understand and are socialized into equality within the family itself. Secondly, allowing women to exercise their skills would double the workforce and mental capacities in a society, as women's subjugation was preventing the society from benefiting from one half of the population's skills and talents. Lastly, Mill also argued that the net happiness of the society can only go up if half the population, that is women, get more liberties. Mill therefore campaigned for equal political and social right for women throughout his life, and he was one among the earliest advocates for women's equality in modern times. To conclude this lecture, J.S. Mill's contributions to political philosophy are varied and consequential. His utilitarian inclination guided all his thinking, be it about rights or about liberties or about subjection of women. Despite some flaws, J.S. Mill was able to put together a coherent utilitarian perspective on many of the pressing issues of his day. His contributions have been so insightful and thought-provoking that they continue to have resonance even till today for the foreseeable future. Dear students, hope you gained some knowledge on J.S. Mill and his political thought. See you in another lecture in modern political philosophy. Thank you and take care.